The Civil War, Chapter 14. Fighting has already started and it's all around us. There are few skirmishes and there are very few in the state of Kentucky. So far, things look pretty good in Kentucky. War, as I've said, is all around us. Up until April 1861, it had been a war of words. After the after the fall of Fort Sumter, we had elections in 1861. So the pro-unionist gained control of the Kentucky legislature. For Confederates, if they can control Kentucky, they can control the Mississippi and the Ohio. It can give them a launch pad into Indiana, Illinois, and Ohio. They can also use the Ohio River to split the Union and attack Pittsburgh. For the Union, they would be able to use the Mississippi River to go down and split the South and attach the southern states. Kentucky had a unique geographical position that everyone wanted. The Kentucky population would be split in three ways. Those who lived on the northern border, the Ohio River corridor, used to dealing with the North, and they were more pro-Union. Those living down south, Tennessee and the Paducah border, were used to dealing with the South, and they were more pro-Confederate. The great majority of Kentuckians living in the middle were kind of fence setters. They did not really want to get involved, but they will. They will be more loyal to whoever's here, and they will lean toward the Union side, as long as they do not try to take away slaves. And so, also on Kentucky's unique position, our neutrality was respected for a while. Uh, the mules made Kentucky a uh, wanted, and it was also an agricultural advantage. Kentucky, Missouri, Maryland, Delaware, all were neutral. They are all slaveholding states who declared neutrality. Called the border states, they are the border between the Confederacy and the Union. Kentucky would be the most important, and whichever way Kentucky goes, uh, the other the others would follow. Simon B. Buckner, he was hired to develop and command a state guard. He is seen as pro-Southern. He's very well trained, well equipped, and occasionally he would fly uh, and sometimes on the Confederates, some would wear gray uniforms. The Unionists in Frankfort became alarmed, and so they organized a home guard. They are pro-Union, and they managed to get a delivery of Lincoln guns. Buckner works to keep Kentucky neutral. He would visit generals on both sides. He's a good Kentuckian, and he wants what's best for Kentucky. Uh, there were some violations of the neutrality, General Pillow, Confederate general. General Grant heard that General Pillow wanted to come in and take Columbus, and so he wound up being stationed in southeast Missouri and waited to see what was going to happen. So Pillow, he decides to move into Columbus before Grant makes that decision. So Pillow, he ends up taking Columbus, and Grant moves to Pittsburgh. The House orders the Confederate and the Union to withdraw. They then change their mind, and it's just for the Confederates to withdraw. Peace conference is called to get together, talk, see what's going on. Again, this is where this was done for the Confederates, just to leave. Once the neutrality ends, Kentucky is pro-Union. So a Confederate Kentucky. Buckner tries hard to keep the state neutral. He decides he cannot support the Union and takes his Kentucky State Guard and goes south. There are some unhappy Kentuckians who meet in Russellville to discuss this. Upon hearing Kentucky's request, Confederate President Davis stated, "You've got to be kidding me. You have a few hundred people who are going to decide for the entire state to become Confederate." And so Davis took Kentucky's request to become Confederate as a joke. Confederate Congress, they would consider it a feather in its hat if Kentucky was a Confederate state. So they overrode the Confederate president's decision, and on December 10th, 1861, they formally admitted Confederate Kentucky as a state in the Confederacy. You could say that Kentucky was two states. Kentucky had a star on both the Confederate and Union flags. Both Confederate and Union presidents were born in Kentucky. Families and churches would be divided. It was truly a brothers' war. George Johnson becomes the Confederate governor. The Kentucky Confederate capital would end up being Confederate, would end up wherever the Confederate Army tent was. So the Confederate capital was the Confederate Army tent. And so just make sure that you read in your textbook why George Johnson wanted Kentucky to join the Confederacy. Johnson tried very hard to create a viable government, but it just wasn't going to happen. Johnson's timing of his enlistment in the 4th Confederate Infantry was not good. He joined in his late 50s. He joined on April 7th, 1861. This was the Battle of Shiloh. He joined April 7th, 1861, and 2 days into his enlistment, he was wounded, and he died a day later on April 8th. This would be known, or this was the Battle of Shiloh, one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. So during the Battle of Perryville, right after this, Richard Hall's becomes successor. He also served in the Confederacy, and during the Battle of Perryville, Hawes temporarily was installed in Frankfort. And after the Confederates left Kentucky, Confederate Kentucky and the provisional government would disappear. Governor Magoffin, he was considered pro-Southern. He was a good man, and he wanted to do what was best for Kentucky. He would veto bills passed by pro-Union legislature. He would veto bill after bill that was against his moral beliefs. And so it was requested that Governor Magoffin during this time resign. His successor would have been James Robinson. However, it was thought that Robinson was unfit to rule as governor. So James Robinson would resign as Speaker of the Senate. John Fisk would become Speaker of the Senate. So Magoffin resigns as governor. So Fisk becomes governor, and once again Robinson would become Speaker of the Senate. So just some little shenanigans kind of going on back and forth. So just make sure that you also read about that in your text. Just some commanders in Kentucky. On the Union side, General Sherman, General Buell, General Halleck, and General Grant. And on the Confederate side, General Johnson and General Buckner from Munfordville. So just some early engagements, skirmishes. Sometimes it's hard to define actually what constitutes a skirmish. Usually it's 24 or more people. It doesn't have to involve land change. And some of them, Rock Castle and Big Sandy Valley in western Kentucky, Sacramento, Saratoga, Sacramento. This skirmish would be led by Nathan Bedford Forrest. Forrest was not respected by other generals. He did not have a high school education, and he had not been to West Point. Before the war, he had one of the largest slave-selling businesses in the South. He was a millionaire. He would join the military as a private, and he would use his own money to equip the cavalry. Word kind of got back. You just couldn't have a private doing this. So he was given commission as a colonel. He was very smart, a good taskmaster, knew how to organize, and he believed war was for killing. General Zollicoffer, he's the Confederate general. He was killed near Cumberland Gap in 1862. 522 Confederates would be killed, and 262 Union troops were killed near Cumberland Gap. So at this time, Southern men, they're eccentric, stubborn, quick to anger, and very zealous of their reputation. Most generals in the South had been generals in the Union Army. Others received commission because they were either wealthy or they helped someone. Some generals, they would discuss tactics, but while they were also discussing tactics, they would be sidetracked. They would be entertaining females, and they would be too busy to show up to fight. Most of the generals did not get along with each other. And so that's just the bullet point just about the bad generaling, the bad generals from the South. January of 1862, Grant moves against Forts Henry and Donelson. One of the bad generaling decisions, Fort Donelson was left unreinforced. So Generals Floyd, Pillow, and Buckner would be put in charge. In the end, General Buckner would surrender to General Grant. Confederates are being pushed out of Kentucky. Bowling Green would be evacuated February 11th, 1862, and Columbus would be evacuated February 27th, 1862. And so the Confederates, they do not have a strong hold in Kentucky. General Johnson, he's a personal friend of the Confederate President Davis. He would face criticism for losses at Bowling Green and Cumberland. General Johnson would. Also would face criticism for losing supplies lost at Nashville. So he would have a concentrated Confederate army at Corinth, Mississippi. Braxton Bragg and P.G.T. Beauregard, they wanted to attack Grant, and I've misspelled attack, so they don't want to attach General Grant. They want to attack him. Beauregard, he is from New Orleans. He's a Union officer, and when his home state of Mississippi seceded, he resigned from his commission and became general in the Confederate Army and would be placed in charge of the South Carolina militia. He's very smart, but he's not a very nice man. So just in the beginning, there would be some initial wins, but again, poor planning would cost the Confederates. General Johnson would be shot and died, and he died. He wanted these battles to be fought in Kentucky, but he wanted the battle that Johnson had wanted at Bowling Green, he fought and lost at Shiloh. And so this will end part 1 of chapter 14.